Now, Andrew has already made a compliment, a very proper compliment to our second speaker, Hillel Newman. It is very difficult for me to present Hillel Newman because he's, first of all, one of my best friends and one whose spirit has depth of rabbinic intensity, more or less, and that I cannot really present him in an adequate way. He is a scholar who has worked mainly on the relations between Jews and Christians in late antiquity, but he is the author of a fundamental dissertation on Jerome and the Jewish traditions. We are expecting, many of the presents here are expecting the publication from Hebrew into English in a book form of this dissertation, which will certainly enrich our perspective of Jerome and which will contribute to correct the judgment that I gave in my keynote lecture that made a bit sad Hillel Newman about the fact that Origen was the only one who seriously dealt with the Jewish tradition and not his Jerome. He's the author of a book on the Maasim Livnei Eretz Israel, Halacha and History in Byzantine Palestine, and of several contributions. I might perhaps also recall the proceedings of a conference in Cardiff, edited by Joseph Lössl and also by Andrew Kane, if I'm not mistaken, into which also Hillel Newman contributed. This is one of the best miscellaneous volume now at hand on Jerome. Hillel will speak about Jerome in the Holy Land, the legacy of Origen, and the legacy of the Jews.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Let me give you my perspective on Lorenzo's talk on Sunday. In that superb keynote address, he said the following about Origen, and I'm quoting from the text: "For no other author of Christian antiquity do we possess evidence of an analogous familiarity with Jewish sages and their exegetical traditions." And after the lecture, I approached Lorenzo, and I did say to him explicitly, I said, "But Lorenzo, what about Jerome?" And then he smiled, and he said that the sentence that I just quoted was a deliberate provocation directed towards me so that I would finally translate and publish my Hebrew dissertation of 20 years ago on Jerome and the Jews. That was Sunday. Today is Wednesday, and I still haven't done it. I'll try, nevertheless, in my presentation today to share with you first, just a few of the overarching conclusions I've drawn in the past about Jerome's dependence on Origen with regard to Jewish exegetical traditions. But what's more important, in my opinion, I'll present several examples of analysis of exegetical contacts between Christians and Jews in order to illustrate and to model a mode of research which continues to yield valuable results. The purpose of such research is not merely to ask if Jerome did or did not make use of information gleaned from Origen's writings, but even in those cases where there are signs of dependence, or at least of similarity, to ask what use Jerome made of the information at his disposal, and whether he continued to be exposed to Jewish tradition above and beyond that which was known to his predecessors. In light of the theme of this year's conference and its venue, I have deliberately chosen several examples that reflect Jerome's interest in Holy Land sites. In a seminal article that appeared in 1934 entitled Saint Jérôme et ses maîtres hébreux, Gustave Bardi challenged Jerome's reputation as a student of learned Jewish teachers by pointing to various passages in which Jerome's testimonies of Jewish traditions appear to have been copied from Greek Christian sources, particularly the works of Origen and Eusebius. There is no doubt that there is truth, that some validity to Bardi's argument, but we must ask how much we may generalize from the passages he cites. For example, he notes a total of 3 cases in which Jerome borrows, as it were, passages in which Jerome and Eusebius write of their own informant, a particular unnamed individual, whereas Jerome presents them, those same traditions, as if they were the words of his own teacher. He steals their teacher. I've counted, however, a total of 37 passages in Jerome's works in which he presents a tradition he claims to have learned from a particular Jew or Hebrew. Yet except for the 3 already identified by Bardi, there is no other evidence, at least that I've found, of plagiarism in the rest of those cases. So there is some statistical evidence to be considered here. I've also cataloged all the passages in Jerome's works in which he attributes an exegetical tradition to the Jews collectively, including those where he speaks of either Jews or Hebrews. There are 388 items in that catalog. That's a considerable amount. And I've found almost no clear case of dependence on Jerome or Eusebius beyond those passages already noted by Bardi in the continuation of the article that I just mentioned. Now, it's true, and this is a matter of no small consequence, that the loss of the greater part of Origen's writings introduces a considerable degree of uncertainty into the whole discussion. There's no remedy to this problem. Methodologically, it's something that is always there. On the other hand, on a number of occasions, Jerome tells us explicitly that he had no commentary of Origen at his disposal, including much of the book of Zechariah, for which he exploited the commentary of Didymus of Alexandria instead. Yet in that same portion of Jerome's own commentary on Zechariah, one finds, and this, again, I catalog the sources, 28 exegetical traditions in the name of the Jews. In several shorter passages in some of his other works, we encounter similar phenomena. So this is in some ways a continuation of the previous argument, but one that is a way of getting around the problem of lost works. How should we go about studying Jerome's Jewish exegetical traditions profitably? In each and every case, it's necessary to compare the passage in question to the works of other Christian authors, on the one hand, particularly, but by no means exclusively, with Origen's writings, and to Jewish sources, primarily rabbinic literature and the Aramaic Targums, on the other. By repeated exercises of triangulation, we seek to identify on both fronts signs of dependence and paths of influence, which often point not merely to simple borrowing, but also to adaptation and even to polemic. In rare cases, the substance of the exegesis itself allows us to draw conclusions about dating the emergence of these traditions. These are indeed exceptional cases, but they have broader methodological implications. I'd like to take a closer look at one of them with you, one which, as we shall see, could never have been taken from Origen, but attests rather to the continuing vitality and timelessness of Midrashic exegesis and is altogether a product of Jerome's own generation. The passage is found in his commentary on Daniel, completed in the year 407, on chapter 11, verse 34, and it's found in translation in your handout. I'll begin with the verse itself. That's number 1 on the handout. The knowledgeable among the people will make the many understand, and for a while they shall fall by sword and flame, suffer captivity and spoliation. In defeat they will receive a little help, and many will join them in sincerely. That's the biblical verse. As is his practice, Jerome brings a series of interpretations, including those of the Hebrews, as follows, and this is number 2 in your handout. Some of the Hebrews understand these things to refer to the rulers Severus and Antoninus, who esteemed the Jews very highly. But others understand them to refer to the Emperor Julian, that is, that after the Jews will be oppressed by Gallus Caesar and endure much in the straits of their captivity, he, Julian, will arise, pretending to love the Jews and promising to offer sacrifice in their temple. In him they will find small hope of assistance, and many of the pagans will join them, not sincerely but deceitfully, and on account of their veneration of idols will feign friendship towards them, towards the Jews. Taking the passage apart, we find 2 different historical interpretations of the verse in Daniel attributed to the Jews. The first follows upon an earlier citation by Jerome of the Jews' interpretation of the defeat of verse 34 as the debacle of the great revolt against Rome that culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple. The, quote, little help that followed is taken to allude to the period of amity between the Jews and the Severan emperors, Septimius Severus himself and his son Antoninus Caracalla. That's the first opinion. The second opinion identifies the defeat with the poorly documented and ultimately ineffectual revolt of the Jews in Palestine in the days of the Emperor Gallus. followed immediately by the little help of Julian's promise to restore the Temple of Jerusalem. It goes without saying that Origen has nothing to do with the second interpretation, nor is there any reason to think he has any part in the first. Neither of these interpretations, by the way, has left a trace in classical midrashic literature of late antiquity. Indeed, rabbinic exegesis of this entire section of Daniel is sparse, and while it's hazardous to draw conclusions from such silences, I suspect that the reticence of the rabbis here is a symptom of their more general discomfort with apocalyptic eschatology. Remarkably, however, the first opinion brought by Jerome in the name of the Hebrews, unrecorded and perhaps deliberately avoided in rabbinic sources, abided in unknown channels till emerging as if from nowhere in a medieval Judeo-Arabic text of the early 10th century. The commentary on Daniel by Saadia ben Yosef, the Gaon of the Jews of Babylonia and the preeminent Jewish scholar of his day. How it was known to Saadia remains a mystery, but rest assured that he did not find it in Jerome's commentary. On the other hand, we owe our knowledge of the Julianic Midrash to Jerome alone. Let's turn to a different example. Just as Jerome is capable of copying a Jewish tradition from Origen, he is by the same token capable of invoking a Jewish tradition to repudiate what he finds in Origen's works. A famous case concerns the burial place of Adam, already mentioned in this conference on several occasions, and just in the last hour in an excellent lecture by Nikolai Patov-Chicherin. There's no reason for me to rehearse the entire topic here. Just in a nutshell, according to the reading of a Greek katena containing an excerpt from Origen's commentary on Matthew, Origen wrote of Golgotha, quote, "It has come to my attention that the Hebrews hand down a tradition that the body of Adam is buried there. The Hebrews are absent in the Latin version of the commentary." The reading of the Greek raises an obvious question. What kind of Hebrews could conceivably propagate such a tradition? Accordingly, it's been suggested that perhaps Origen refers to Jewish Christians, or that perhaps he's misrepresented some other burial tradition reported to him by Jews, or I would add in the name of Jews. In any case, upon settling in Bethlehem, Jerome, ghostwriting for Paula and Eustochium, wrote a letter to his patron Marcella in Rome, that's letter 36, encouraging her to join her friends in the Holy Land, and there he says of Jerusalem, this is number 3 in your handout, "It is said that in this city, indeed in this very spot, Adam both lived and died. Thus the place where our Lord was crucified is called Calvary, clearly because the skull of the ancient man was buried there." Jerome, it appears, embraced Origen's tradition. Yet in an abrupt reversal, he proceeded over a period of some 20 years to disavow that tradition repeatedly, arguing instead that Adam was buried with the patriarchs in Hebron, a claim grounded in exegesis of the Hebrew text of Joshua 14. This in itself would be sufficient reason to assume that Jerome's source is a Jewish tradition, and in fact, he says as much in his eulogy for Paula, that's letter 108, written in 404. Jerome writes of Paula's pilgrimage route as follows, number 4 in your handout. From there, that's from Abram's terebinth at Mamre, she, Paula, arose and went up to Hebron, which is Kiryat Arba, that is to say, the town of 4 men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the great Adam, whom the Hebrews say is buried there according to the book of Joshua. In light of what Jerome wrote in Paula's name 18 years earlier in letter 46, this comes across as a particularly crafty and shameless bit of revisionism. Scholars have noted that such a Jewish tradition is indeed found in several rabbinic texts. I mean the burial of Adam as the fourth figure in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. And we find that particularly in Genesis Rabbah, which even alludes obliquely to the verse in Joshua. That's the same verse that Jerome invoked in the name of the Jews as being the proof text for that burial in Hebron. Isaiah Gafni has even suggested in the study of Jewish traditions on the burial of Adam that the Midrash locating the burial in Hebron, contrary to earlier extra-rabbinic tradition, emerged only after Origen's time and was in fact a response to the Christian claim of burial at Golgotha. In any case, for our purposes, we note that Jerome, upon learning something new from the Jews, and this is, as I said, this is a documented Jewish tradition, has changed his mind and implicitly invokes the authority of Jewish exegesis to reject Origen's burial tradition. And assuming that he's familiar with the mention of Hebrews in Origen's commentary on Matthew, then we find ourselves in a position watching Jerome essentially pitting his own Hebrews against those of his predecessor. This last example illustrates nicely the blurred boundary between, on the one hand, the investigation of holy places and their local traditions, Jewish or otherwise, as ancillary to Christian tradition of the Bible and in antiquity. On the other hand, the appropriation of these traditions by guides and travelers as part of Holy Land pilgrimage lore. Jerome, of course, straddles both categories, the critical scholar and the devout pilgrim, though not without tension, as we've just seen. It's long been recognized that Christian pilgrimage accounts are often infused with elements of geographical midrash, usually without acknowledgement and probably without even awareness of their Jewish origins. Some historians claim that Christian pilgrims commonly engage Jewish guides from whom they learn directly of these traditions. That isn't implausible. But the only evidence for the existence of such Jewish guides with which I'm familiar comes from Jerome. In the introduction to his translation of the Book of Chronicles from the Greek, he prides himself on having traveled around the entire province of Palestine in the company of those he described as the most learned Hebrews to study the land firsthand, and he alludes again to a Jewish guide in the introduction to his commentary on the book of Nahum. Let's return to the description of Paul's pilgrimage in letter 108 and examine a remark made by Jerome in passing, in which he again differs from Origen, apparently, so I'll argue, under the influence of Jewish tradition. This is number 5. She also venerated the tombs of Joshua, son of Nun, and Eleazar, son of Aaron, priest on Mount Ephraim, opposite her, one of whom, that's Joshua, was buried in Timnat Serach on the northern side of Mount Gash, and the other, Eleazar, in Gibeah of his son Phinehas. She was rather astonished that he who distributed the properties, Joshua, would choose for himself one so mountainous and rough. Jerome describes Paula as a first-hand witness of the terrain of Joshua's burial place on Mount Gash. Without prompting, she expresses surprise at the disparity between Joshua's authority to apportion land as he wishes and his choice for himself of so uninviting a property, rugged and unsuited for cultivation. What inspires Paula's response? There is no appeal here to either Christian or Jewish tradition, only as Jerome portrays it, her spontaneous reflection based upon observation. Yet this deceptively simple passage is best understood in light of other Christian and Jewish sources, as we can see in another exercise in triangulation of the sort I mentioned earlier. First, let's take a look at one section of Origen's 24th homily on the book of Joshua. The verses of interest are Joshua 19:49-50, describing the allotment of the land. Here, that's number 6 in your handout. When they had finished allotting the land by its boundaries, the Israelites gave a portion in their midst to Joshua, son of Nun. Command of the Lord, they gave him the town that Joshua, had asked for. Timnat Serach on the hill country of Ephraim, he fortified it and settled in it. Later in Joshua and again in Judges, we read of Joshua's burial in Timnat Serach. Here's what Origen has to say about Joshua's estate, granted him only after all the tribes had received their portions. And this is number 7. And he did not presume for himself a portion of the inheritance, but he received it from the people. The people gave him an inheritance from that which they themselves had received. For thus it is written, and the sons of Israel gave Jesus, the son of Nun, a portion. But these things happened figuratively to them in order to set before us as a model. See therefore how the leader who brought them into the Holy Land, into the land of promise, was himself of the people. He was the successor of Moses, yet he does not allow himself to claim a portion of the land. Instead, though he is the leader of the people, he waits to receive a small portion from the people. After he receives his small portion, Joshua, worthy of his name, builds and constructs back to the place that he received, so that he may make it truly worthy as a gift of God and a divine inheritance. Origen chooses to emphasize the exemplary qualities of the leader who takes nothing for himself till his people have received their share, and even then it is they who grant them his own small portion. Its smallness apparently suggested by the fact that Joshua is allotted only a single city in contrast to the tribes who are given large territories consisting of many cities. Jerome's Joshua seems likewise to display unusual humility. That much is implicit in Paul's astonishment at the sight of Mount Gash. Yet the similarity to Origen's Joshua ends there. Paul is not interested in whether Joshua received his allotment first or last, or that instead of taking it for himself, he waited for a grant from the people of Israel. On the contrary, in Jerome's concise depiction, it was Joshua who chose his own estate, thus explicitly in the biblical text, and it is precisely his choice that demonstrates his modesty. not because the portion is small, but because it is mountainous and harsh. Let's compare what we've just read in letter 108 to a passage in one of the lesser-known Aggadic works from late antiquity, a short Hebrew composition entitled The Midrash of 10 Exiles. Its date is uncertain, but nothing in it suggests that it was composed after the end of Byzantine rule in Palestine. At any rate, the affinity to the text in the handout to Jerome's account of the sighting of Joshua's burial place should be obvious. The Midrash of the 10 Exiles describes 10 expulsions from the land of Israel from Sennacherib to Hadrian. A tale is told of Hadrian's tour of the tombs of biblical heroes, highlighting those of Joshua, Moses, whose tomb eludes detection, and David. Hadrian was indeed a great traveler, historically, but the Hebrew legend is a projective product of the imagination. More than a Roman emperor who has just crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian looks like a late antique Roman aristocrat on a Christian pilgrimage tour of Palestine, filled with respectful admiration for the three biblical leaders. In the handout I brought only the beginning of his itinerary, and this is number 8. He, that's Hadrian, traveled throughout the land of Israel to see the tombs of the kings and prophets. When he arrived at Timnath Serach, he found the tomb of Joshua, servant of Moses, and he inquired of the captives and said to them, "Whose tomb is this?" They said to him, "It is that of Joshua, our judge and ruler." He said, "Indeed, you have never had as faithful a ruler as he. He bequeathed to you a rich and good land, but had his body buried among the mountains and boulders." The linguistic affinity to what we saw in Jerome should be here. There is no mistaking the parallel to letter 108, not only in the depiction of the rugged terrain of the plot chosen by Joshua, that in which he was ultimately buried, but also in the admiration expressed by the passing travelers. Time doesn't permit a thorough analysis of the entire tale of Hadrian's journey in the Midrash of the 10 Exiles, but it can be shown that it contains various Midrashic elements known from other Jewish sources, woven together into a single narrative and embellished. Timnath Serach, known in the Bible solely as the estate and burial place of Joshua, is described in Genesis Rabbah as one of the, quote, 4 objectionable places in the land of Israel. And others interpret its name with Midrashic ingenuity to emphasize its repugnance. Clearly,
Jerome and the Midrash of the 10 Exiles share a common tradition, and these other sources suggest that it originated among Jews. Jerome once again diverges from Origen and displays profound affinity to a Jewish geographical Midrash. Whether this was something picked up from a Jewish teacher or had already become part of the common law of Christian tour guides and pilgrims, I can't say, but nothing is like it is found, as far as I know, in any other pilgrimage text of the period. We've just seen 2 cases of Jerome's connection to geographical Midrash and compared him to Origen, but I would be remiss if I did not, in a lecture on Jerome, give Bethlehem its due. Notwithstanding the importance for Christians of the events concerning Philip, Cornelius, and Paul in Caesarea, according to the book of Acts, one must concede that Caesarea was little match for Bethlehem as a place of religious significance for Christians in the 4th century. It's not surprising that Jerome, Bethlehem's greatest local patriot, should extol its virtues with the fervor that Caesarea could not have inspired in Origen, even if he were inclined to such veneration. In the final selection, I'd like to show you how Jerome uses a Jewish Midrash to weave a sort of Christian Midrash about the Virgin Mary in Bethlehem. For lack of time, I can't bring all the sources or discuss all their complexities, but I think you'll be able to get a general idea of what Jerome is doing. Let's turn back to the handout and read in Numbers 9 and 10 from Psalm 132, that's Masoretic 132, and from Jerome's homily on that psalm. Psalm, "I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, an abode for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard it was in Ephrat. We came upon it in the region of Yar." Jerome notes that according to one interpretation, these verses may be read as an allusion to the nativity in Bethlehem, since in the Bible, Ephrat was in fact another name for that city. Ephrat is Bethlehem. He continues, "But let us see why Bethlehem received the name Ephrat. It is written in the books of Chronicles that Maria, that is Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, had a husband named Or. After that, a succession is written, and it says, Maria, sister of Moses and Aaron, she is Ephrata. That is written in the book of Chronicles. Seek and you shall find. Accordingly, this Ephrata, that of the psalm, got her name from that Ephrata, that is from Maria, Miriam, sister of Moses. Perhaps it seems to someone this isn't true, since it is so novel, but I refer to him, I refer him, any such person, to the authority of the book of Chronicles. And Jerome returns to the verse in Psalms. Behold, we have heard her in Ephrata. The Hebrew doesn't have her, rather it has him, that is, he who will be born of the seed of David. We have heard him in Ephrata because it is understood of Maria. Jerome's point is that he, Christ, will be born in Ephrata, Bethlehem, to the Virgin Mary, whose name is anticipated by the first Mary Ephrata, that is, Miriam, sister of Moses. That's all very clever and very interesting, but there are several problems. The minor one being that regardless of what Jerome says, at least the Masoretic text reads Shema Nuha, we have heard her, not we have heard him. But putting the textual question aside, there's a bigger problem. Despite Jerome's bluster, the verses that he insists are found in Chronicles simply do not exist. By the way, he makes similar but briefer claims to in his translation of Eusebius' Onomasticon and again in one of his letters. That's letter 65. Miriam's marriage to Or or Hur is mentioned once without explanation by Josephus, suggesting a complex of interpretive tradition with its roots in Second Temple Judaism, but Josephus' brief remark can't account for all that Jerome says in his homily. Another fragmentary tradition is brought in the name of the Hebrews in a passage from a Greek katena on Psalms published by this is number 11, who attributed the material to Origen. The index of the Biblia Patristica relegates it, however, to the status of Origen's dubia. In any case, I am not competent to express an opinion about the sources of that katena, and I would be welcome for any suggestions. As for the remark itself, it says there, on Psalm 132, quote, according to the Hebrews, Ephrata signifies Maria. It's helpful to learn that the Christian author in Greek expressly associates this particular tradition with the Hebrews, but there is no further explanation of how those Hebrews may have arrived at their surprising conclusion. Why is Maria here? Why are they the same? And again, there's clearly a connection to Jerome's interpretation, but we still lack a rationale for most of its parts. Most of the pieces come together when we turn to parallels in rabbinic literature. I've brought only two examples, and only one of which that we'll look at here. The first from Sifrei on Numbers, a Midrashic compilation from roughly sometime in the 3rd century. Miriam was married to Caleb. As it says, when Azuvah died, Caleb married Ephrat. Well, we understand from this that Ephrat has to be Miriam, because that's Caleb married her, but we still don't understand why we should make this equation. And the Midrash proceeds to interpret a related verse in Samuel. David was the son of a certain Ephratite in Bethlehem. Thus David was one of the descendants of Miriam. Again, Ephrat is Miriam, so Miriam is an ancestor of David the Ephratite. An elaborate Midrashic rationale for the equivalence of Miriam and Ephrat is found in Exodus Rabbah, that's number 13. I won't go into that here. There are other variants of that Midrash in other sources. Looking at the proof text in the Midrash here and elsewhere, we begin to understand where Jerome got the notion that Ephrat's identification with Miriam is found in Chronicles. Yet he has clearly gotten muddled up, which doesn't stop him from trying to load his shaky erudition, in this case, over the reader. He's basically reading a Midrash, or transmitting a Midrashic tradition as if it were scripture, because he seems to have been confused. His memory is deceiving him. Nevertheless, Jerome does do a striking job of domesticating a Jewish Midrash for Christian exegesis of Psalm 132. Ephrat in the Psalm is a name of Bethlehem, but it is simultaneously a reference to the Virgin Mary, all anticipated by the first Ephrat, Miriam, the sister of Moses, who, we should note, is recognized in the Midrash, next to last source, as a foremother of David. I don't see any reason to assume that all this comes from Origen, but if more lost homilies of Origen are rediscovered and they contain all these elements, I will happily stand corrected. That was for you. I conclude. In his book, Jerome, Greek Scholarship in the Hebrew Bible, Adam Commissar remarked that Jerome, quote, probably achieved more than anyone else in collecting as much material concerning Hebrew matters as was available in Greek exegetical works. Commissar continues, this fact has led some to believe that he was almost exclusively dependent on Greek sources in interpreting the Hebrew text. It would appear rather that Jerome simply exploited Greek sources as far as was possible. These sources, however, could only take him so far. Thus, Commissar on Jerome as a Hebrew philologist and translator. I believe this assessment to be no less true of Jerome the exegete, and the collector of Jewish interpretive traditions, many of which, as is well known, and some of the examples I've brought today further demonstrate, are not even marked expressly as Jewish. Jerome, as we know, is inconceivable without the precedent of Origen. But that fact must not distract us or prevent us from recognizing and appreciating the enormous mass of Jewish material in Jerome's work, which distinguishes him from Origen.